Religious discrimination is a phenomenon as old as religion itself. Throughout history, we have examples, often very distressing ones, of marginalization, segregation, and in some cases, atrocities committed in the name of a deity. For those living in Britain in the early 19th century, a long shadow of religious turmoil lay thick over society. Memories of popish plots, civil wars, and the religious roller coaster of successive Tudor monarchies may have been more than a century away, but they had dominated social discussions around religion, leading to stigmatisation and the exclusion of Catholicism on a government-sanctioned scale. But what, if anything, did this mean for the British Army? How dangerous did officials think it was to have Catholic soldiers serving a Protestant king? And how much stigma was attached to serving the defender of an alternative faith? Tonight, Catriona Kennedy returns to the Napoleonic Wars pod to discuss the challenges and the soul-searching facing Irish Catholics in the British Army. We talk about motivations for enlistment, pragmatic approaches to religious tolerance, and why it's so difficult to unlock the experiences and thoughts of these men who made up such a substantial proportion of King George's army. This is the Catholics of the British Army. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Napoleonic Wars podcast with me, your host for today, Liam Telfer. As always, I'm joined with someone. It always seems to be you, my good friend, Dr. Zach White. How are you?
I am good. It's because you can't get rid of me, mate. It's not because you want me in the co-pilot seat. It's because you just don't get a choice.
I keep thinking one of these days I'll be on an episode with Luke and or Josh and mix things up. But I don't know. Maybe they're doing their own thing in like the East Wing of Napoleonic Wars pod towers.
I can't work out if this is a complaint, whether this is sort of a delicate way of you saying, look, I'm bored of you, Zach. Can I please just host with somebody else? You know, somebody who is less rabbit holey, who doesn't spend 20 minutes talking to the guest before we even start recording, as I've just done. Is this your way of sort of getting around the fact that you don't have a union on this show to represent your interests?
Yeah, that's it. Luke and Josh and I are going to unionize. That's exactly how we'll solve that problem. I'm definitely not sick of you. It's just interesting. We'll get there one day. Anyway, back to the show. I don't want to take up too much time rabbit holing because that's not my bag. We have an extra special guest with us today, as you heard in the sexy intro. Catriona Kennedy is a reader in modern British and Irish history at the University of York. She has published widely on the revolutionary Napoleonic period, with a particular focus on gender history, the 1798 rebellion, and the history of Irish soldiers in the British Army, which is one thing we'll be looking at today. Her latest book, Women, Politics and the Irish Public Sphere in the Age of Revolution, will be published by Oxford University Press in May of this year, 2025, which we are very excited about and have already written down in my notes to plan a follow-up episode. Catriona, how are you? Thanks for being on the show.
Very well. Thank you very much for inviting me to come on. I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
Well, it's our pleasure, really. We're just two goons with a microphone. You guys, the guests, are the real reason why we have the following that we do. And I'm going to dive straight in because I feel like we've got lots to get through, and as always, we may go off on a tangent. Now, set the scene for us, and this is probably a huge question in itself. But what does the law say about Catholics joining and serving in the army? And where does it come from?
So in 1793, so at the beginning of the Revolutionary Wars, Catholics are still officially prohibited from enlisting in the British Army. And in 1793, that law will be repealed. They will finally be allowed. But to really understand, I suppose, where that prohibition came from, and particularly in relation to Irish Catholics, we probably have to go back a century to the 1690s and to William III's defeat of King James II on Irish soil in 1691. And that leaves Ireland in the control of a Protestant Anglican minority who control the Irish Parliament, and they pass a series of laws depriving Catholics of various rights, the rights to freedom of religious worship, the right to vote, and so on. But they also have a real military objective, these penal laws. So they're designed to undermine Catholics' ability to launch another Jacobite rebellion. So they have a military objective. So Catholics aren't allowed to bear arms. They're not allowed to own a horse that's worth more than £5. And they're also forbidden from enlisting in the British Army. And so what that means is that for most of the 18th century, Irish soldiers, Irish Catholics who want a military career have to join continental European armies. So they're joining the armies of France, of Russia, of Austria. But in 1793, at that point, the British state really sees Ireland as a very fertile recruiting ground. You know, the manpower demands of the army have been increasing through the 18th century. So they're desperate to recruit Catholics into the British Army. So they give some concessions to Catholics in exchange for that service. They've been kind of enlisting surreptitiously since the American War, but this is when they're officially allowed to join. And Irish Catholic officers are also allowed to hold commissions in the army, but not outside of Ireland. There's a bit of a kind of fudge around that question. Can they still be officers when they travel to England or Scotland?
In some respects, I feel we should bring Andy Dorman into this conversation. Folks will be pretty familiar at this point with Andy's voice from our 18th century Way of War series. I must also say, I think this is the first time that the 17th century has got a mention on this episode. I was at the British Society for 18th Century Studies conference a couple of weeks ago, and somebody was talking about bringing the 21st century into 18th century studies. I sort of thought, well, are we approaching this sort of never-ending 18th century? Never mind like a long 18th century. But Andy's research is really important to this within the context of what he's looked at in the 18th century in terms of how there is, as you say, this law that stipulates that Catholics cannot join the British Army. And yet, when somebody deserts, you get these sort of interesting, particularly Irish. So, as I understand it, there is a point at which Irishmen cannot join the British Army. And so there are these sort of inventive ideas like, let's take these guys to Scotland, enlist them in Scotland, and then bring them back to Ireland so that they are part of the Irish establishment. And what all of this fundamentally means is that you absolutely have Catholics in the British Army long before 1793 and the lifting of this legislation. It's just that everybody sort of goes, well, pragmatism trumps whatever the law says. So how much undermining of this system do you think there is before we get to the change in 1793? And I guess what kind of precipitates that change in thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, obviously, if you are trying to raise a regiment and you see, you know, there are strapping young men who happen to be Catholic, that you would love to have in your regiment, you're not going to be asking them too many questions about their religious origins, or you're going to try and fudge that. So certainly it seems it's hard, that they aren't collecting official statistics on this. So Andy's work has been really interesting in terms of trying to estimate how many Catholics would have been in the army in the 18th century, despite official prohibitions. But yes, so they're certainly being surreptitiously allowed to enlist, and there's various workarounds there. But so it's more really about the symbolic significance of giving arms to Catholics, given that for much of the 18th century, Catholics are the enemy. British identity, the identity of the British Army, is in part founded on this idea of fighting the Catholic powers of Europe. So when initially it's in 1778 that it's first proposed that the prohibition on Catholics joining the army should be repealed during the American War, and that provokes a huge popular outcry. It leads in 1780 to the Gordon riots, which is probably the most sustained period of kind of popular upheaval and rioting in London's history. It's really the closest that England comes to revolution in the 18th century. So they're really battling a very strong popular hostility towards the idea of armed Catholics. And that has begun to thaw a little by the end of the century, though. Jacobitism is no longer a threat to the stability of the British state. More tolerant attitudes towards Catholics are emerging. But the Protestant ascendancy, in Ireland, who are still trying to retain their exclusive control of the Parliament and state in Ireland, they're more uneasy about these kind of initiatives. It is the British state that is pushing Irish Protestants to give concessions to Irish Catholics because they need them for the war effort. They want to recruit them.
So, at the risk of doing what I think is termed a Zach at this point, and creating a crime and punishment turn to this interview, as Liam rolls his eyes in despair at my ability to shoehorn discipline into every single interview that we ever do. Church parade. I'm going somewhere with this, folks. Catriona can see where I'm going immediately. It's written into military law that soldiers have to attend church parade. If you fail to do so, I think it's actually a regimental court-martial offence rather than a general court-martial offence. But all of my understanding of this comes from 1795 onwards, and therefore postdates this change. And the one point where I have seen this raise its head is where somebody is accused of being absent from church parade, but of course it's a Protestant church parade, and they've been permitted to go to a Catholic church parade by their officer, and so the whole case gets quashed. Now, before this point, there can't be that official acknowledgement from an officer. Pre 1793, this isn't allowed. You're not allowed to be Catholic and in the army. Therefore, you can't have a dispensation from your officer to go and attend a Catholic service on Sunday, as opposed to the usual army's Protestant service. So, do we have any indication of whether there is a workaround, and quite how soldiers might have felt at being forced to attend a church service that is fundamentally the wrong denomination for them?
It's a good question. And actually, I don't think we really know that much for the earlier period. I mean, so the rules about mandatory attendance at the Anglican service, those are officially removed in 1811. So after that point, it is stipulated in army regulations that soldiers should be allowed to worship according to their persuasion. Before that, you know, possibly they will turn a blind eye if certain soldiers don't want to attend an Anglican service. Um, I also think we maybe shouldn't overestimate how religiously devout the men who joined the army would have been. I suppose this is partly because the Catholic Church in 18th century Ireland, technically freedom of worship isn't allowed to any Catholics for most of the century. So it's an underground religion, even though it manages to maintain a very strong presence, but it's quite weak. There weren't really that many priests. It would have been quite difficult to attend mass for these people anyway. So it's not necessarily that the people who would have been joining the army would have had been accustomed to regularly attending mass every Sunday, in the way that by the 19th century there is a much stronger culture. There's a devotional revolution that develops a much more standardized culture of Catholic practice. So I suppose, yeah, would they have been offended by attending an Anglican mass or an Anglican service, or would they have seen it as just part and parcel of being part of the regiment, just another duty that they had to, do grudgingly or not?
Catriona, I kind of want to look at some factors, I guess, that are outside of just the religion, and I guess also that probably transcend both pre 1793 and post. But what were the sort of social and economic factors that motivated Irishmen, predominantly Catholics, but I suppose also Protestants, to join the British Army? And are those different? Are those motivations different between those joining in as soldiers in the rank and file, and for those joining as officers?
Yeah, I think the kind of motivations for joining the army for Irish soldiers, Catholic and Protestant, who are going into the rank and file, are pretty similar to those of English or Scottish soldiers. So their economic motivations. Jim Deary, who I don't know if you've had Jim on, but he's done some really interesting statistical work on Irish soldiers in the British Army, which suggests that the majority of those who enlisted were coming from agricultural labouring backgrounds or were weavers. So those are kind of precarious forms of employment. So they would have had a steadier income in the army, and as well as benefiting from the bounty, which was often quite a strong incentive for joining. So there's some evidence that Irish soldiers may have enlisted to escape sectarian conflict at home. From the 1790s onwards, there's quite intense clashes between Catholic and Protestants in various areas around Ireland, and County Armagh, which is one of the largest recruiting grounds for Irish soldiers, is the site of some of the most intense conflicts. There's the expulsion of Catholics from that area. That's the culmination of some of that tension. So in perhaps a surprising way, the British Army may have been a kind of refuge from some of that religious tension that recruits were experiencing at home. In relation to officers, both Protestant and Catholic, again, you have similar motivations for joining as motivate officers in Britain. So, often there'll be younger sons of families who aren't going to inherit the business or land and need to find an alternative source of employment. But particularly with the Irish Protestant class, there is quite a strong tradition of military service, some of which stretches back to the fact that these are descendants of soldiers who fought with the English armies in the 16th and 17th centuries. So again, another mention of the 17th century here. So there is that kind of military tradition amongst the Irish officer class, the Protestant officer class. And that really continues through the Napoleonic Wars and into the 19th century. So in the Napoleonic period, Irish Protestants are comprising about a third of the officer corps in the British Army. And relative to their population size, that's a really outsized contribution. So they are in some ways a kind of militarized caste, a militarized culture.
I love that we're basically turning the Napoleonic era into a sort of century and a bit of a phenomenon either side of 1815. Welcome to the long Napoleonic Wars, which seem to start in about 1660 and will end, I don't know, let's say 1848 for the sake of neatness, but probably not. Jokes aside, you've kind of preempted something that I was going to ask, and I suspect the answer to this is a very short and simple no. But when you started talking about this, I couldn't help wonder if there was a sense of tension and crisis of the soul, I guess, is kind of what it's not a crisis of confidence, but a sort of a sense of religious soul searching or some kind of interior struggle with this idea that, you know, as a Catholic, serving in a Protestant army, serving in a force that is fundamentally in Ireland as a force of occupation. You know, we could have this debate about Ireland being treated as something like a quasi colony in a number of respects. There's a whole podcast just on that. But the British are in Ireland and the British Army is in Ireland in order to stamp authority on Ireland. Lots of concern, obviously, about rebellion. 1798 would obviously loom large in that conversation as well. Is there any kind of sense of, perhaps the material doesn't survive on this, but any sense of Catholics kind of thinking, I'm serving in this army out of necessity, but is this going to have kind of some impact on my soul, and sort of dealing with that thought process?
It's a really interesting question. And unfortunately, you know, for the most part, we don't have a huge amount of that more interior, you know, or introspective memoir writing by Irish Catholics who served in the British Army. But I think to try and explain actually how they might have been able to reconcile their religion with service in the British Army, we have to think about actually what they were, the wider war that they were fighting. And, you know, for many Irish Catholics, you know, they see this as a war or they can see it as a war in defense of Christianity against you know, the threat of republicanism and atheism that the French Revolution, firstly, and latterly to, you know, Napoleon is understood as representing. So certainly for the Catholic officers, Irish Catholic officers, many of who would have served firstly in the French army and were loyal to Louis XVI. And a lot of those Irish Catholic officers in the French army are executed during the Revolution. And those who aren't executed, a number of them then transfer into the British Army, first into this Loyal Irish Brigade and then into other regiments. So for them, you know, it's perfectly easy to reconcile their previous loyalty to the Bourbon dynasty and the French royal family, and now within the British Army continuing to fight against the French Republicans and then Napoleon. So I don't think it necessarily leads to that you know, cognitive dissonance that you might think it would. Yeah, and it's more difficult to know what ordinary Irish soldiers would have thought and felt about this. For many, as for a lot of soldiers, it's a job. It's it's not necessarily something that they think about in ideological terms.
I wonder if I wonder if the fact that a lot of Irishmen went abroad with for military service, you mentioned earlier Austria, Russia. I wonder if that has a hand in the sort of making it much easier to then join an army that's closer to home, even if it may seem foreign. I might be sort of barking up the wrong tree, but I guess the transition, if given a choice, you might rather serve at home than in Central Europe. Am I completely wrong in that, or?
No, that makes a lot of sense. And it's very much what seems to happen. The moment that possibilities for service in the British Army open up, so the moment a labour market opens up in Ireland, the Irish military service reorientates itself from the continent towards the British Army. So it is a kind of pragmatic adjustment to the opening up of a new military labour market, you might say. And there are, I suppose, advantages, although a lot of Irish recruits possibly only spoke Irish. The majority would have being able to speak English or would have been bilingual. So they would be joining an army where the language of everyday use was one that they understood. So there are kind of already affinities there with the broader culture of the military.
Now, looking at this from a sort of an official point of view, how do the British government at the time view Irish recruits? I guess you could say during this period, but I would also guess that it might change significantly throughout the period. And does the government try to sort of, I think, eradicate, Irish culture within these guys might be a bit strong, but do the British government try and sort of anglicize Irish recruits? Some may have, background within, previous rebellions, or is it a case that the British government's using Ireland as a boost for recruitment and for manning?
So primarily, of course, they're seeing our soldiers as, just a very useful a weapon of war, as it were, and they aren't particularly interested in ideological indoctrination. And certainly the army itself, the British Army in this period, more generally doesn't concern itself that much with trying to propagandize its troops. That's seen as something that the French army does a lot, and it's seen as un-British in a way. But also I think it's because they're sensitive to the fact that it's a multi-denominational kind of multinational army. They're integrating Scottish Highland troops as well as Irish troops. There are different religions, Presbyterianism as well as Catholicism. So they have to be able to flexibly accommodate all those different identities. So they don't really try and emphatically bang on with a king and country sort of messaging. I think knowing that could have alienated some of the soldiers that they've enlisted. There is a kind of sense, particularly after 1801, so after the Act of Union between Britain and Ireland, that military service might help, though, to integrate Ireland into this new United Kingdom, that there will be some kind of ways in which the culture, British culture and Irish culture will kind of be able to merge or meld through these kind of interactions.
So, with an eye on active service, there are some curious kind of ways of arguing this. Britain during the Peninsular War quite obviously deploys to a Catholic country, or Catholic countries, we should say, in the form of Portugal and Spain, um, to fight a nation that, as you've said earlier, in some respects is sort of seen as atheistic and republican, but also has very strong, very profound Catholic roots, which again sort of raises some interesting questions about things like the role of nationalism, national identity. How do you identify? Do you identify as Irish? Do you identify as British? Do those concepts even really exist during this period? You know, all of the Linda Colley style questions that we occasionally sort of look at during this show. So when Britain's Irish troops are serving in these Catholic countries, how how do folks feel about that, both within the British government? You know, is there a sort of sense of, do we need to be a little bit careful here? You know, what if you have Irishmen fighting Irishmen over the course of this conflict through those that are serving in the French army? And equally, from a sort of hearts and minds local population perspective, is there a sense of sort of greater affinity, or should we put more emphasis on the reactions that are perhaps more vocal in some of the memoirs of, you know, sort of why are these folks sort of so backward? But I'm also sort of, as I'm saying that, thinking, well, half the reason that sometimes the Portuguese and the Spanish are characterized as being, inverted commas, backward is because of their superstitions around religion. So I've sort of answered my own question in the course of waffling there. But perhaps you can give us a more erudite and more reasoned and intelligent kind of explanation of what the heck's going on.
No, it's a really interesting question. And I imagine that this may well have come up talking when you were talking to Gavin Daly about British soldiers in Madrid. But of course, you know, one of the things that really comes out of British soldiers' accounts of their experience in the Iberian Peninsula is the way it activates this kind of latent anti-Catholicism that's so strong in British popular culture. So they are being immersed in this culture of Catholicism, where there's all these, you know, Catholic rituals and processions and ornate statues and cathedrals, and are kind of shocked by it. And, you know, as you were saying, they see this as symptomatic of Catholic, or the Catholic superstition they've been warned about. And of course, for Irish Catholic soldiers as well, you know, this would have been quite disorientating for them, because they're coming from a culture where, you know, public displays of Catholicism have been pretty much suppressed. You know, it is a kind of submerged religion. So that's quite disorientating for them, but they certainly are able to make contact with a lot of the Irish Catholic exiles who have been driven to the continent in the 18th century. So there's a network of Irish colleges in Spain and Portugal. So that's where the Irish priests are able to be educated. So when they're in Lisbon, for example, the Connacht Rangers, the 88th, they become very close to the priests who are based at the Irish College in Lisbon. You know, they claim them as their very own regiment. So automatically, Irish Catholic soldiers have a kind of rapport with this culture of continental Catholicism that, of course, isn't available to Protestant soldiers in quite the same way. And that also causes some tension, because the president of the Irish College in Lisbon directly requests the British Army that he be allowed to send Catholic priests to accompany the army, so that they can minister to the Catholic soldiers. And that's quite seen as quite controversial, you know, that's a step too far. It's one thing to be tolerating, Catholic soldiers in the army, but actually to attach a Catholic priest or a set of Catholic priests to the army is, not quite thinkable in the same way. Um, so yeah, I mean, I suppose you were kind of wanting to think about some of the interactions with the local population as well, and how they're shaped by the fact that the Irish soldiers and the Spanish and Portuguese do share the same religion. And certainly that seems to help quite a lot. There's the Protestant soldiers are often complaining that all the Spanish and Portuguese see them as heretics, that they're heretics because they're not Catholic, whereas the Irish are viewed as good Christians because they're Catholics, and they can often get out of trouble, if they're caught stealing or if there's some other kind of tension. They are able to explain, oh, but this, I'm a good Irish Catholic, and the locals might let them off for offences that, as you'll know better than me, Zach, would have been capital offences. They could have been hung for stealing a pig or whatever. And yeah, and there's some examples as well of English soldiers pretending to be Irish so that they can ingratiate themselves with the local ladies. So definitely, yeah, there it is shaping their distinctive experiences, particularly in the Iberian Peninsula. They're experiencing that culture differently, the Protestant and the Catholic soldiers.
Now I've got to get this mic out of Zach's hand before he jumps on. You did mention Crime and Punishment, and I can see him start to twitch. So before
meerkat mode activated, unquestionably.
Yeah, it's like Periscope up for you, Zach. We talked about the sort of relationship between Catholic soldiers, Irish Catholic soldiers, and the sort of populace within these Catholic countries. And now I think something that would be interesting to look at is fraternization. There are a lot of examples of pickets, of soldiers fraternizing of all nationalities during the period, really. But were there any distinct affinity between Irish, British soldiers, as it were, and French counterparts because of that sort of deep-rooted Catholicism? Like that joint religious belief, or I guess through direct contact, because we know Irishmen served for the French. They were Irish soldiers in Bonaparte's service.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I don't think that despite, I suppose, the background of a shared Catholicism, because, again, French troops are being viewed as as kind of leading this, the suppression of Catholicism in Spain and elsewhere. I don't think it really is grounds for affinity in the way it might have been in earlier periods. Um, and, I'm sure Irish soldiers fraternize with French soldiers in just the same way that English soldiers occasionally do. There are, though, you're right. I mean, thinking about the fact that some Irish soldiers will end up fighting in Napoleon's Irish Legion, for example. There is an anecdote, which I've never really been able to verify whether this is true or not, of two brothers, one of whom had ended up fighting for Napoleon's Irish Legion, and the other who was fighting with the British Army, who finally meet on one of the Napoleonic battlefields. And at that point, they toss a coin to try and decide which side they're going to fight on. So I don't know if that's true, but it is an anecdote that I have read about. But for the soldiers who are fighting in Napoleon's Irish Legion, there's an interesting example of a memoir by a man called Miles Byrne, who was a United Irish rebel in 1798. He goes into exile. He becomes an officer in the Irish Legion. And he is with the occupying French forces in Spain in 1809. And he meets this Spanish priest and has this conversation with him, where the Spanish priest is challenging him and saying, um, surely, what we're trying to do, what the Spanish are trying to do in resisting the Napoleonic invasion and occupation is exactly what you were trying to do, what the Irish were trying to do in 1798. We're trying to assert our independence, and we're trying to defend our religion. And that really unsettles, you can tell it kind of unsettles Byrne, this conversation. And he does recognize that this Spanish priest, this patriotic priest, reminds him of the priest that he had fought alongside in 1798. And he can see, that he does have a point. What are you doing here? Why are you trying to invade and occupy our country? So I'm just kind of, I suppose, telling that story just as an example of how, I suppose, complex and tangled, the lines of friendship and enmity can be, affinity and enmity can be in this period because, of these different kind of religious and ideological and political divides that are kind of driving conflict.
Apologies, this is a very sort of I'm spitballing off the top of my head here kind of question, which admittedly won't sound any different from the usual waffle that I produce on this podcast. But as you're talking about this, I'm just wondering about whether there are concerns about this kind of legacy of 1798 from on high, whether it's at governmental level, whether it's at horse guards, whether it's with people like Wellington, or sort of more regionally across the British Empire. Is there a concern about sort of a residual kind of bubbling tension and quite what might happen if those passions become inflamed again? Thinking, as we know, that about a third of the British Army fundamentally is Irish in its origins. I was immediately sort of scratching my head trying to think about whether or not there's evidence to suggest Irish battalions might have deliberately been kept separated from one another, as in sort of classically Irish battalions. And then, of course, thought, well, if a third of the army is Irish anyway, even in the sort of English or Welsh regiments, then that's a bit of a nonsense. But is there any sort of sense of concern that maybe we need to sort of split up the Irish regiments? Is there any kind of concern that tensions might resurge and therefore lead to issues, or is this something that just doesn't hold up against scrutiny?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there'd be some grounds for thinking that they would be concerned potentially about this. I suppose thinking about an example that may have been in their minds, the naval mutinies in 1797 and 1798. Now, at the time, it is suggested that it's because of the Irish presence and the presence of these defenders and other rebels in the Navy, many of whom have been pressed into the Navy, that's kind of driving the mutinies and sedition. There. So, even though that kind of interpretation has been modified by later historians, but actually, there doesn't seem to be that much concern about subversion or sedition within the army. And partly, actually, the enlistment of Catholics into the army is sold to more conservative commentators in Protestant Ireland as getting rid of some of these troublesome elements. Like, wouldn't you prefer them to be, away from Ireland and serving overseas rather than causing trouble at home? So that is that sense that it's a safety valve. For troublemakers, is there to a certain extent, and of course there are, you know, a not insignificant number of the rank and file have been forcibly pressed in a way into the army because they were suspected rebels. So they've been given the choice of either being transported to Australia or serving in the army. And some of them do escape, are absolutely resistant to the red coat. But there's lots, again, of anecdotal evidence that some of those people who join, having been suspected of rebellion, go on to have very good careers in the army, that they go on to become NCOs and so on. Rifleman Harris, he says that one of his closest friends in the army was a rebel who had fought at Vinegar Hill in 1798 and went on to become an adjutant and so on. So yeah, it's that we don't have maybe as much evidence to get a clear sense of what's going on here, but certainly, yeah, there's limited sense of a kind of potential mutiny or potential sedition coming out of the Irish ranks.
Catriona, I just wanted to ask it's very self-indulgent question. Is there any difference between literacy rates in Ireland and in England or in the British Isles? I'm thinking particularly for the rank and file, obviously.
Yes, it's a good question, and I don't have the figures, the data off the top of my head. Yes, certainly for Catholics, it would be much lower. There are, you know, uh, many barriers to education, poverty, and so on. I think it's been estimated that the literacy rate for the British rank and file is maybe 47%. Is that right?
Yeah,
Um,
about that.
yeah, so I think it would be higher for certain groups. So Ulster Presbyterians would have higher literacy rates than the average population, but I think they would certainly be lower for Irish Catholic signature literacy, at least. And of course, that's going to have, I imagine, if this is where the question's leading, that's probably going to have implications in terms of promotion for Irish soldiers, if they don't have the literacy skills required for those NCO roles.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just a huge thing, isn't it? Being able to read, not only for advancement within the army, but also for the attainment of knowledge from other sources.
Mhm.
And I think it's probably quite interesting to look at how Irish Catholics were affected by I say education or lack the barriers to education, either prior joining the army, maybe that's why they joined the army, and then their advancement in it.
Mhm.
But thank you for that. Yeah, that's really interesting. I definitely think this is something that we need to look at in the future, Zach.
Do you know, I think that's the first time that you've asked a question that genuinely felt left field. Like, don't get me wrong, we both rabbit hole, me much more so than you. But I think that's the first time where you've asked a question that felt left field and then you've brought it back in, which might kind of add to your argument that maybe you need to spend less time hosting with me and more time hosting with the others who don't just kind of come out with these random questions. You might be right. We might have sort of come to a realization, an epiphany that actually you need to spend less time with me as a co-host because clearly I'm having a malign influence. Bringing it back to the focus of the interview, though, I want to start thinking about legacies and longer term impacts. These guys obviously, if they're lucky enough to survive, go home at the end of the war or go home at the end of their service, depending on quite where they sit in terms of the British government actually letting them go, which becomes a whole problem in and of itself during the latter stages of the Napoleonic Wars. Um, and these guys have left their homes. They've gone and served under a Protestant king. And then they've got to go back to their friends, their family, their comrades, people who, they might have sat with at one point in time and discussed politics with. Is there any kind of stigma attached to the fact that they've gone and served in the British Army? Do we have any sense of them being shunned? And equally, is there any indication that actually the army helps to lead to more sort of cultural assimilation, perhaps, in the sense of Irishmen and particularly Irish Catholics who've served in the army and then decide to settle elsewhere within the United Kingdom as a result of their service?
I think that's a really great question and a really interesting question. And unfortunately, one we don't know a huge amount about. This research just hasn't been done. And I would love it if somebody would do more work, for instance, on the Chelsea pensioner records, as well as the records of the Kilmainham Hospital, the Irish equivalent to Chelsea, to really try and reconstruct what happens to all these Irish military veterans. Um, James Deary, who I've already mentioned, he has begun to do some interesting work on this, just looking at where Irish soldiers are discharged. So he's shown that the majority of Irish soldiers are discharged in England, which suggests that they probably settle there. And we can kind of supplement that with anecdotal evidence. So Ned Costello, who some people will be familiar with, from the 95th Regiment, he settles. He's originally from Dublin, but he settles in London. And in his memoir, you definitely get the sense that there's a wider network of former comrades who have also settled in England. So I think, this could be one of the big waves of Irish settlement in England prior to the famine, that we're seeing in the post-war period. But what happens to those who return home? I'm really curious about this myself. There's again, it's been speculated that they may go on to provide military training to some of the Irish protest movements or protest groups. That they're helping them with drilling and military knowledge. They may just have been seen as sort of interesting funds of, exciting military tales in their local communities, as well. I mean, some will also kind of become involved in policing activities. In Ireland, that's quite a common route for those who've been employed in the army. But I think it's a fascinating question that we only can answer quite tentatively now.
Well, this is part of the problem and the challenge, right? That the British government has been pushing this idea of, look, all four nations fighting together
Mm.
against a unifying French threat. To what extent is that being, well, it is being used as an effort to try and foster sort of senses of national identity. And so these Irish soldiers going back to their families, in some respects, are a representation of that.
Mm.
But whether or not the message matches the reality, you can project that propaganda fundamentally to the British people, but whether or not they absorb it is something else entirely. And I do wonder to what extent there is a difference in reception of that message in Ireland versus in England. It's perhaps a little bit easier to imagine this sort of, it feels somewhat self-indulgent, this sort of message of, oh, look, we've had our differences in the past, but, in order to achieve this success, all four nations had to play their part. It's a message that perhaps would sit much better in London than it would in Cork, for example. Do you know what I mean? Is that your sense?
Yes, I mean, I think the big issue here, is, and as I've been talking about, Catholic recruitment into the army is always about these kind of trade-offs, between the British state and the Catholic community. So, if you send men to serve in the army, we'll grant you these concessions, we'll extend your rights. And in 1801, with the Act of Union, again, there's the assumption that that's going to be accompanied by full emancipation for Catholics. So Catholics will be allowed to sit in the new British Parliament. But that doesn't happen. So there's a real sense at the end of the war that Irish Catholics sacrifice it, for this kind of British victory has been completely unrecognised and unrewarded. They thought they would get full emancipation and they haven't. And that really poisons the legacy, I think, of the Irish contribution to the defeat of Napoleon, which is substantial. They're a third or more of the army. It's 150,000 soldiers fighting throughout this period. But that sense that they got nothing for it does mean that it allows Irish nationalists to really sort of play on the antipathy towards the British Army and, that kind of rhetoric from the 1840s onwards of taking the Saxon shilling, this idea that actually it is an act of national betrayal to join the army, which isn't there earlier in the period, but that really gains momentum, partly because, they have failed to kind of to recognize the contribution that has been made.
You've sort of touched on the legacy there, and I kind of want to push that further. I know we're supposed to stop at 1815, as it were, but in terms of the implications for later Irish identity and the independence movement and movements that come in Ireland in the future, would you say that this is perhaps one of the sort of, I mean, I wouldn't want to say it, planting of a seed, because I think it's obviously been going on, as you said earlier, it's been going on for hundreds of years. But is this a huge part of that setting up this independence movement, or are there other factors that matter more?
Well, I think what we can see happening is it's the failure to celebrate and really make more of the Irish Catholic contribution during these wars, and the failure to pass Catholic emancipation, which is probably more important, but they're connected. That, in a way, really seems to ensure Irish Catholic alienation from the United Kingdom. So, there is maybe an alternative history where emancipation is passed and, much more is made of Irish Catholic soldiers. So something similar to the way that the Highland soldiers celebrated in Scotland. And that makes that really helps to bind Scotland to the Union, that celebration of Scotland's distinctive martial heritage is really, essential to Scottish unionism in the 19th century and into the 20th century. But there isn't really any effort to do that for Irish soldiers in the same way. So a lot of the commemoration of Ireland's military history is completely focused on one person, which is the Duke of Wellington. Naturally, perhaps, he's a pretty important figure. But, there's the Wellington testimonial in Phoenix Park in Dublin, but then there's nothing commemorating the men he served under him, the many, many Irish men. So that kind of the history of that service is kind of forgotten, or it's secluded in Irish history, when it could have been something that might have, I suppose, supported an argument for the Union. And then nationalists are Irish nationalists really emphasise two different Irish military traditions. So they want to celebrate the Irish military tradition that involved service in European armies and involved fighting against the British in various rebellions in Ireland. And they completely shun the very significant Irish military tradition within the British Army. So that's kind of not seen as something that can be celebrated by nationalists. And you can see that with the independence, very little is made of the Irish soldiers who fought with Wellington, who fought in the Napoleonic Wars, they're really not part of the Irish national conversation. And it's really only recently that, people in the Republic have begun to recover those histories, and lots of interesting histories of the men who fought at Waterloo and so on. So when there was the bicentenary of Waterloo, actually there was much more interest, in the Republic than there would have been previously in remembering those soldiers. So there's been a bit of a shift, I think, more recently, that there's Ireland's more comfortable and confident in reflecting and remembering some of these histories.
Catriona, it's always cracking to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking us on such a kind of wide-ranging and thought-provoking journey through some pretty tough questions. I think what has come out very clearly through this is how hard it is to try and get to some of these answers, because there is source material, the complexities of these issues, the fraught nature of them. This is what history involves, folks. A lot of kind of head scratching and trying to work out some really difficult answers to very complex questions. You inevitably need to go and read more about Catriona's research. So, where to start? Well, firstly, head over to Palgrave Macmillan, where you will find narratives of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, military and civilian experience in Britain and Ireland. It's part of their War, Culture and Society series, if you're struggling to find it. But also in May, bookmark this, if needs be, even kind of have it on your wish list on Amazon. Yes, I've mentioned that sort of den of devilish roguery that is Jeff Bezos's platform. But if it means that you go and buy this book, then I will allow it. You have my permission, because you really needed my permission to go and buy a book off Amazon. Women, Politics and the Irish Public Sphere in the Age of Revolution. It's coming out with Oxford University Press in May 2025. Yes, we would prefer you to go direct to the publisher, inevitably. But please make sure that you do bookmark that. And we will, of course, make sure that we sit down with Catriona close to the time in order to discuss that in more depth. Catriona, always a joy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Liam. A real pleasure chatting with you.
This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will be back very soon. Folks, do me a favor. Go and review the show. Do it right now. 5 stars, please, and a comment, crucially. It takes you seconds, but it sends the algorithm wild and catapults us up the rankings. It's the most powerful thing you can do to support the hours of content that we provide for free. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Sign up to our newsletter. The link is in the description, and get regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars Pod merch. Check out the link in the description. And did you know you can now gift people subscriptions to the Patreon perks we offer? So, if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive Meet the Author sessions, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars Pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, book clubs, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much, much more. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a near daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month. So if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-January 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Peter Findley, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, Robin Brasher, Daniel Friedman, and Jonathan Willets. The Admirals, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Moran, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin. The Marshals, Ryan Diamond and J.C. Kaiser. The Legion of Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham. And in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.